If you walk into your kitchen right now and look at a piece of fruit sitting in a bowl, you might notice a tiny, almost invisible change. Maybe the skin of a peach has gone a little soft, or a banana has developed a few more brown speckles than it had yesterday. It looks like a mundane, boring sign of rot, something to be tossed in the trash and forgotten, but that tiny softening is actually a high-stakes chemical laboratory in action. It is the beginning of a process that arguably built every city, every empire, and every library on this planet. This quiet decay is the central clue in a mystery that took scientists nearly a century to solve. It's a mystery about why we, out of all the millions of species on Earth, decided that a mild neurotoxin was the most important thing to ever happen to us. For decades, the case was considered closed. We assumed humans started farming, grew some grain, and accidentally discovered a fun side effect. But that explanation was a false lead. The real investigation into how ancient humans discovered alcohol takes us much further back than the first farm, beyond the first city, and even before the first modern human ever stood upright on the African savanna. This is a cold case 10 million years in the making. To solve the mystery of how we first encountered alcohol, we have to look at the suspects, our own ancestors. For a long time, historians believed that alcohol was a cultural invention, something we figured out once we were smart enough to build jars and stay in one place. However, recent biological evidence suggests that the story didn't start with a choice. It started with a survival crisis. Around 10 million years ago, the climate in Africa began to shift. The lush, dense forests were drying out, and the fruit-bearing trees were becoming more spread out. Our primate ancestors, who lived almost entirely in the canopy, were suddenly facing a food shortage. As the fruit in the trees became scarce, they were forced to do something dangerous. They had to come down to the forest floor. On the ground, the only fruit available was the stuff that had already fallen. It was bruised, it was mushy, and most importantly, it was fermenting. While that sounds like a straightforward win for a hungry primate, it actually presented a massive biological wall. Most animals can't process ethanol, the type of alcohol produced by fermenting fruit. In high enough concentrations, it's a poison. If a primate ate too much of that rotting fruit, it would get disoriented, lose its motor skills, and become an easy meal for a waiting predator. Yet, we know that our ancestors survived this transition. To find out how, researchers like Dr. Stephen Benner at the Foundation for Applied Molecular Evolution conducted a forensic investigation of our DNA. In 2014, Benner's team resurrected ancient enzymes from our evolutionary past to see when we gained the ability to digest alcohol. They focused on an enzyme called ADH4, which is responsible for breaking down ethanol in the gut. What they found was a smoking gun in our genetic code. About 10 million years ago, a single mutation occurred in the ADH4 gene of the common ancestor we share with chimpanzees and gorillas. This wasn't a minor change. This specific mutation made the enzyme 40 times more efficient at breaking down ethanol. Even though this genetic upgrade seemed like a lucky accident, it was actually the key that unlocked a new food source. Suddenly, those primates who carried the mutation could eat the fermenting fruit on the ground without getting sick or dangerously drunk. They had access to a massive calorie boost that their competitors couldn't touch. This leads us to the drunken monkey hypothesis, a theory popularized by biologist Robert Dudley. He argues that our attraction to the smell of alcohol isn't just a modern vice. It's an ancient homing beacon. In a dense jungle, the scent of ethanol drifts much further than the scent of fresh fruit. To a starving ancestor, that smell meant high-energy food this way. We didn't discover alcohol because we wanted a party. We discovered it because we wanted to survive. But as compelling as this biological clue is, it doesn't explain how we went from eating mushy fruit on the ground to deliberately brewing beer and wine in massive quantities. Although the drunken monkey theory explains our biology, it suggests we were passive participants in the discovery, just animals following a scent. But the archaeological record reveals a much more intentional investigation. For years, the prevailing verdict in history books was that the Neolithic Revolution, the move from hunting to farming, was driven by a need for bread. The theory was that humans settled down to grow wheat and barley for food, and then at some point someone left their grain out in the rain, it fermented, and presto, we had beer. It was a nice, clean story, but it's increasingly looking like another false lead. In the late 20th century, archaeologists began finding evidence that turned this timeline completely upside down. The most famous clue comes from a site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. This site is roughly 11,000 to 12,000 years old, making it one of the oldest monumental structures ever found. It features massive T-shaped stone pillars carved with images of wild animals. But the real mystery lay in what was found near those pillars. Archaeologists, led by the late Klaus Schmidt, discovered several large stone vats, some capable of holding up to 40 gallons of liquid. Chemical analysis of the residue inside these vats revealed traces of calcium oxalate, a substance known as beer stone that forms during the brewing process. Here is the problem for the old bread-first theory. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. They hadn't developed permanent farms yet. They hadn't domesticated wheat. They were still moving around, yet they were already brewing beer on a massive, almost industrial scale. Instead of alcohol being a side effect of farming, the evidence at Göbekli Tepe suggests that alcohol might have been the reason for farming. This is known as the beer before bread hypothesis. The theory posits that the desire to have a steady supply of fermented drinks for rituals and social gatherings was so strong that it forced humans to settle down and figure out how to grow grain reliably. Brewing beer is a complex, multi-step process that requires a lot of labor and a lot of grain. If you're a nomad, you can't easily carry 40-gallon stone vats and hundreds of pounds of fermenting mash with you. You have to stay put. So, the mystery of why humans gave up their free wandering lives to become backbreaking laborers on farms might have its answer in a beer mug. That might sound like a reach, but the investigation deepens when we look at the Natufian culture in the Levant. In Raqefet Cave, located in modern-day Israel, archaeologists found stone mortars carved directly into the bedrock dating back 13,000 years. This was thousands of years before the first evidence of domesticated grain. Analysis by Li Liu from Stanford University found starch granules and phytoliths that proved these people were malting and mashing wild barley and wheat. They were quite literally making caveman beer long before they ever thought to bake a loaf of bread. This changes our understanding of the discovery entirely. It wasn't a mistake made by a bored farmer. It was a deliberate technology developed by hunter-gatherers who were using nature's chemistry to transform their environment. Despite the mounting evidence for beer, it wasn't the only clue left behind by ancient chemists. If we move the investigation to East Asia, we find a completely different set of ingredients, but the same underlying obsession. In the village of Jiahu, in the Yellow River Valley of China, researchers discovered pottery jars dating back 9,000 years. These weren't just any jars. They were sophisticated vessels designed for storage. A team led by Patrick McGovern, often called the Indiana Jones of ancient ales, used a technique called gas chromatography mass spectrometry to analyze the invisible residues trapped in the clay. The results were a revelation. These 9,000-year-old jars contained a Paleolithic cocktail, a fermented mixture of rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit or wild grapes. This wasn't a simple accident of nature. To make this drink, the ancient Jiahu people had to understand how to break down the complex starches in rice into fermentable sugars, a process that usually requires mold or human saliva. They were blending ingredients from different sources, the forest, the field, and the beehive, to create a specific flavor and potency. This suggests that by 7000 BC, the discovery of alcohol had already moved into a phase of molecular gastronomy. They weren't just finding alcohol, they were designing it. While these archaeological finds give us the where and when, they still leave the why wide open. Why would these early societies invest so much energy into something that doesn't actually provide a massive amount of nutrition compared to the effort required? This is where the detective work moves from the dirt to the mind. To solve this, we have to look at the social glue theory. Early human societies were growing. We were moving from small family bands of 20 or 30 people to larger settlements of hundreds or thousands. In a small band, you know everyone. You trust everyone. But in a large group, you are surrounded by strangers. This creates tension, suspicion, and the potential for violence. While it's true that alcohol can lead to conflict today, in an ancient context, it acted as a vital social lubricant. Alcohol triggers the release of dopamine and endorphins, and in small social settings, it increases levels of oxytocin, the bonding hormone. When people drink together, they are more likely to share stories, laugh, and form emotional connections with people outside their immediate family. For a burgeoning civilization, this was a massive advantage. It allowed leaders to organize large-scale projects like building the pyramids or the temples at Göbekli Tepe by creating a sense of shared community and rewarding laborers with a communal high. In fact, we have records from ancient Sumer and Egypt showing that workers were often paid in beer. In Egypt, a standard daily ration for a pyramid builder was about 2 gallons of a thick, nutritious, low-alcohol beer. It wasn't just a treat, it was a primary source of hydration and calories that kept the workforce happy and cooperative. But this lead takes us into a darker part of the investigation, the hydration paradox. It's often said that people in the ancient world drank beer and wine because the water was too dirty to drink. While that's a popular theory, it's not entirely accurate. Ancient people weren't stupid. They knew how to find clean springs and well water. However, as human settlements got larger and more crowded, their water sources did become contaminated with parasites and bacteria like cholera and typhoid. Fermentation naturally kills off many of these pathogens because of the alcohol content and the acidity of the drink. So, in a strange twist, the discovery of alcohol might have been a public health breakthrough. Populations that drank fermented beverages had a survival advantage over those who drank from contaminated streams. This wasn't just about getting a buzz, it was about not dying of dysentery before you reached the age of 30. While the evidence for hygiene is strong, some critics argue that the negative effects of alcohol would have outweighed the benefits. They point to the poison lead, the fact that alcohol is, by definition, toxic. So why didn't evolution weed out the drinkers? This brings us to a fascinating concept called hormesis. This is the biological phenomenon where a small dose of a toxin can actually trigger a beneficial response in the body. For ancient humans, the mild stress that alcohol put on their systems might have actually made them more resilient in other ways. More importantly, the high caloric density of alcohol was a lifesaver. A thick, grain-based beer is essentially liquid bread. In a world where the next harvest was never guaranteed, being able to store calories in a liquid form that wouldn't rot, because the alcohol preserved it, was a brilliant survival strategy. The investigation then takes us to the Americas, where the clue was neither grain nor fruit, but a giant, prickly cactus. In ancient Mexico, the discovery of alcohol centered around the agave plant. Long before the Spanish arrived with distillation technology to make tequila, the indigenous peoples discovered pulque. This was a milky, slightly foamy drink made from the fermented sap of the agave. Unlike beer, which requires heating and mashing, pulque ferments almost spontaneously once the sap is collected. The Aztecs and their predecessors considered this drink sacred. It was the blood of the gods. But even here the mystery remains. Why make it sacred? Why wrap it in religion? The answer likely lies in the power of alcohol to induce altered states of consciousness. To an ancient mind, the feeling of intoxication wasn't just a physical sensation. It was a bridge to the spirit world. It was a way to communicate with ancestors and gods. By making the discovery of alcohol a religious experience, early societies could control its use and ensure it was used for social cohesion rather than individual destruction. However, just when the case seems to be pointing toward a universal human discovery, we find a clue that suggests it wasn't just humans who were in on the secret. The mystery expands into the animal kingdom. We've seen elephants in Africa seek out the marula fruit and birds in the northern hemisphere getting tipsy on fermented berries. But the most revealing clue comes from the pen-tailed tree shrew of Malaysia. This tiny creature lives almost entirely on the fermented nectar of the Burdam palm. This nectar can reach alcohol concentrations of up to 3.8%, which is roughly the same as a light beer. The tree shrew drinks the equivalent of several glasses of wine every single night, yet it shows absolutely no signs of intoxication. It has evolved a hyper-efficient way to process the alcohol so it can get the calories without the hangover. This realization forces us to reevaluate our entire verdict. If a tiny tree shrew could figure out the alcohol game millions of years ago, then our discovery wasn't really a discovery of a new substance. It was the discovery of how to control a substance that had been part of the Earth's ecosystem for as long as there had been sugar and yeast. The investigation wasn't about finding alcohol. It was about humans finally becoming smart enough to master the microscopic organism that makes it, yeast, specifically Saccharomyces cerevisiae, or brewer's yeast. This tiny fungus is the real mastermind behind the entire mystery. It is one of the oldest domesticated animals in human history, even though we didn't know it was a living thing until the 1800s. We discovered that if we provided a specific environment, warm, sugary, and sealed off, this invisible ally would transform our food into something more calorie-dense, more shelf-stable, and more socially powerful. But even with all this evidence, there is still one clue that researchers are only just beginning to understand: the cognitive leap hypothesis. Some evolutionary psychologists argue that alcohol played a direct role in the development of the human creative mind. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, planning, and rigid, logical thinking. It's the adult in the room. Alcohol temporarily dampens the prefrontal cortex, which allows for more divergent thinking, the ability to make strange, creative connections between unrelated ideas. In a small, controlled dose, alcohol might have allowed ancient humans to think outside the box, leading to breakthroughs in art, storytelling, and even tool design. We often think of the discovery of alcohol as the beginning of our downfall into vice, but it may have been the spark that allowed our ancestors to imagine things that didn't exist yet. While that sounds like a perfect closing argument for the benefits of the discovery, the case isn't quite that simple. We also have to look at the biological price clue. Not every human population discovered or utilized alcohol in the same way. For example, many populations in East Asia developed a different mutation, a variant of the ALDH2 gene that makes it harder to process acetaldehyde, the toxic byproduct of alcohol. This is known as the alcohol flush reaction. This genetic clue suggests that for some societies, the risks of alcohol, like liver damage or social instability, were so high that evolution actually pushed back, creating a biological deterrent to drinking too much. This shows that the discovery of alcohol wasn't a one-way street to progress. It was a high-stakes gamble that different cultures played in different ways. As we move toward the final verdict of this investigation, we have to look at the legacy clue: how this ancient discovery shaped the world we live in today. If you look at a map of the world's first civilizations, they are almost all alcohol cultures. The Sumerians had Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. The Greeks had Dionysus. The Chinese had their sacred bronze wine vessels. Even the layout of our modern world, the way we organize our cities around social hubs, the way we conduct business over drinks, the way we celebrate milestones, is a direct echo of those first hunter-gatherers gathering around a stone vat at Göbekli Tepe. We are a species that was literally shaped, both biologically and culturally, by the process of fermentation. So, how do we close the case? The mystery of how ancient humans discovered alcohol wasn't solved by finding one single inventor or one single moment. Instead, the evidence points to a three-act drama. Act 1 was biological, a 10-million-year-old mutation that allowed us to come down from the trees and eat fermented fruit to survive. Act 2 was accidental. Hunter-gatherers discovering that wild grains and fruits could be transformed into something more powerful through the invisible magic of yeast. And Act 3 was intentional, the beer before bread transition, where we chose to settle down, build temples, and start farming specifically to keep the drinks flowing. We often like to think of ourselves as the masters of our environment, the brilliant architects of civilization who used our big brains to solve the problem of hunger. But the investigation into alcohol suggests a humbler truth. We didn't build civilization because we were smart. We built it because we were hungry for a calorie-rich buzz that helped us get along with our neighbors. We followed a scent of rot into a new way of life. The drunken monkey in our DNA gave us the equipment, and the social glue in our cultures gave us the motive. While the case of the discovery of alcohol seems to be a story of human triumph and the birth of society, the final piece of evidence brings us back to that mundane piece of fruit in your kitchen. We like to imagine that we are the ones who tamed yeast and turned it into a multi-billion-dollar industry. But if you look at the verdict from the perspective of the yeast, the story changes. Saccharomyces cerevisiae has successfully convinced the most dominant species on the planet to clear vast forests, plant millions of acres of its favorite grains, and build climate-controlled laboratories just to ensure its survival and reproduction. We didn't just discover a drink. We entered into a 10,000-year partnership with a fungus. Despite all our technology and our fancy labels, we are still essentially doing what those primates did on the forest floor 10 million years ago. We are seeking out that chemical signal of high energy calories and social bonding. The discovery of alcohol wasn't a historical event that happened once and ended. It is a biological relationship that is still being written in our DNA. We didn't just find alcohol. We were molded by it. And that brings us to the final, most undeniable piece of evidence in this entire investigation. We often assume that our modern relationship with alcohol is a recent development, a byproduct of the last few thousand years of history. We think of ourselves as far removed from those wandering hunter-gatherers who stumbled upon a pile of rotting fruit. But the truth is buried in a number that dismantles every assumption we have about our sophisticated beginnings. The genetic mutation that allows you to sit at a bar and enjoy a drink without dying of toxicity didn't happen when we built the pyramids, and it didn't happen when we started farming 10,000 years ago. It happened roughly 10 million years ago, in a creature that hadn't even evolved a human-shaped brain yet. Our ability to handle alcohol is 50 times older than our entire species. We were drinkers before we were even human.